to see a world in a grain of sand, and a heaven in a wild flower. Hold infinity in the palm of your hand, and eternity in an hour. A robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. A dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hell through all its regions. A dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state. A horse misused upon the road calls to heaven for human blood. Each outcry of the hunted hare a fibre from the brain does tear. A skylark wounded in the wing, a cherubim does cease to sing. The gamecock clipped and armed for fight does the rising sun affright. Every wolf's and lion's howl raises from hell a human soul. The wild deer, wandering here and there, keeps the human soul from care. The lamb, misused, breeds public strife, and yet forgives the butcher's knife. The bat that flits at close of eve has left the brain that won't believe. The owl that calls upon the night speaks the unbeliever's fright. He who shall hurt the little wren shall never be beloved by men. He who the ox to wrath has moved shall never be by woman loved. The wanton boy that kills the fly shall feel the spider's enmity. He who torments the chafer's sprite weaves a bower in endless night. The caterpillar on the leaf repeats to thee thy mother's grief. Kill not the moth nor butterfly, for the last judgment draweth nigh. He who shall train the horse to war shall never pass the polar bar. The beggar's dog and widow's cat, feed them and thou wilt grow fat. The gnat that sings his summer's song poison gets from slander's tongue. The poison of the snake and newt is the sweat of envy's foot. The poison of the honeybee is the artist's jealousy. The prince's robes and beggar's rags are toadstools on the miser's bags. A truth that's told with bad intent beats all the lies you can invent. It is right, it should be so. Man was made for joy and woe. And when this we rightly know, through the world we safely go. Joy and woe are woven fine, a clothing for the soul divine. Under every grief and pine runs a joy with silken twine. The babe is more than swaddling bands. Throughout all these human lands, tools were made and born were hands. Every farmer understands Every tear from every eye becomes a babe in eternity. This is caught by females bright and returned to its own delight. The bleat, the bark, bellow and roar are waves that beat on heaven's shore. The babe that weeps the rod beneath writes revenge in realms of death. The beggar's rags fluttering in air does to rags and heavens tear. The soldier armed with sword and gun palsied strikes the summer's sun. The poor man's farthing is worth more than all the gold on Afric's shore. One mite wrung from the labourer's hands shall buy and sell the miser's lands, or if protected from on high, does that whole nation sell and buy. He who mocks the infant's faith shall be mocked in age and death. He who shall teach the child to doubt, the rotting grave shall ne'er get out. He who respects the infant's faith triumphs over hell and death. The child's toys and the old man's reasons are the fruits of the two seasons. The questioner who sits so sly shall never know how to reply. He who replies to words of doubt doth put the light of knowledge out. The strongest poison ever known came from Caesar's laurel crown. Naught can deform the human race like to the armour's iron brace. When gold and gems adorn the plough, to peaceful arts shall envy bow. A riddle or the cricket's cry is to doubt a fit reply. The emmet's inch and eagle's mile make lame philosophy to smile. He who doubts from what he sees will ne'er believe, do what you please. If the sun and moon should doubt, they'd immediately go out. To be in a passion you good may do, but no good if a passion is in you. The whore and gambler by the state licensed build that nation's fate. The harlot's cry from street to street shall weave old England's winding sheet. The winner's shout, the loser's curse, dance before dead England's hearse. Every night and every morn, some to misery are born. Every morn and every night, some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to sweet delight. Some are born to endless night. We are led to believe a lie when we see not through the eye which was born in a night to perish in a night, when the soul slept in beams of light. God appears and God is light to those poor souls who dwell in night, but does a human form display to those who dwell in realms of day. Hello everyone, welcome back to another poetry reading. This week's poem was Auguries of Innocence by William Blake. Now, after some feedback from last time, I thought it would be better if we read the poem first and then had our introduction and analysis, so that anyone who just wants to listen to the poem, they can do that, and anyone who wants to carry on for the introduction and analysis can do that. It does seem a little bit strange perhaps to have the introduction after the poem, but that's okay. If you want to read the poem again after it, you can just click back. And the other thing to say is that this is not a classroom. We don't want to overanalyze the poetry that we're reading. We want to enjoy it, we want to feel it, and so with that in mind, why don't we have a look at the opening 4 lines of today's poem. So the opening 4 lines are probably the 4 lines most sort of mused upon by literary scholars. The paradox of holding infinity in the palm of your hand, the complexity of a grain of sand or a wildflower, all contained within your hand, and the immeasurability of it all. And I think for me, these 4 lines, they really set the tone for much of Blake's work, and to some extent the romantic movement that he would later be associated with. More than that, though, I think it's just the sheer mystery of it all. Blake was a mystic. He had frequent visions, particularly of his dead brother Robert, who Blake actually claimed that Robert had suggested the sort of innovative printing technique that he used in much of his artwork, which is a really fascinating and I think quite funny episode. And it's this mystery, as we really get into this poem, that I want to emphasise. A lot of people understandably struggle to understand poetry, a lot of poetry. And I really get that. I do. I think most of us sort of find it difficult at times to understand poetry and certain poems in particular. I certainly do. But I want to put this to you. Poetry is not, first and foremost, something that is meant to be understood, at least not in a sort of classroom kind of way. It's something that's meant to be sat with and experienced and felt. And so last week when I read Henry Vaughan's The Night, that poem, when I first heard that poem some years ago, I actually didn't understand it at first. I understood very little of it. But something clicked within my soul and I felt it straight away. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes you do have to work at it. You do have to sit with it for a while. But that's the point, is you have to sit with it. You have to mull it over. You have to feel it. And when I did that with The Night, it was only after then that I began to understand it. And I think William Blake does this really well for people, because he says, no, don't think about it. Feel it. Feel the infinite complexity of a grain of sand or a flower. Feel the paradox, the mystery. Only then can you really feel and therefore know the divine. After the opening 4 lines, we've got what are, to my mind, probably the most famous lines. Certainly the first 2 are the most famous lines in the poem. A robin redbreast in a cage puts all heaven in a rage. And the second, the 3rd and 4th lines, a dove house filled with doves and pigeons shudders hell through all its regions. And this is often interpreted as a condemnation of humanity's subjugation of nature, as well as the loss of innocence that comes with that. And that's not wrong. It's definitely not wrong. Blake was absolutely preoccupied by these themes, but I think this interpretation misses something that's crucial to Blake's poetry. And that is that, and I don't know if Blake would have spelt it out in quite this way, but I think it's there nonetheless. And that is that Blake's poetry has a view of nature that is very inclusive of humanity. Humanity is not just destroying nature, humanity is destroying itself as part of nature. And I think it's only if you read it this way that you really begin to understand what it was that Blake was getting at. William Blake was hugely concerned about matters of social justice, what we would call today social justice anyway. They might not have called it that back then. And, you know, special snowflake that he was a keen abolitionist. And he wrote about this in his poems regularly. But it's often obscured by our interpretation of the language he uses as being, specifically about nature and loss of innocence alone. So here, for example, the robin redbreast in the cage is to be understood as enslaved human beings, both those in the transatlantic slave trade and those in poorhouses and stuffed up chimneys. So absolutely, yes, it is indeed wrong to cage a bird, and William Blake very much feels that. There's a surface level reading there that is right. But the more important point is that it's wrong to cage your brother and your sister. And this is the thing. Throughout this poem, throughout a lot of William Blake's work, there are metaphors and juxtapositions everywhere, and almost every one of them is making what I would call a prophetic point. And by prophetic, I don't mean that it's, predicting the future as such. Maybe that's present sometimes, we'll see that a bit later on. What I mean is it's making a moral point that's revealed by God. So, for example, the dog starved at his master's gate predicts the ruin of the state because the dog is actually the starved and abused populace rising up in revolution. Blake lived at a time of massive social and political upheaval. The American and French revolutions absolutely captured his imagination, at least initially. He's a bit more critical later on. But they captured his imagination because William Blake always consistently railed against injustice and longed for freedom. Now, I can't end this video without addressing what for some will be the elephant in the room. So I'll read it again, and warning for the language that will be used here. The whore and gambler by the state, licensed, build that nation's fate. The harlot's cry from street to street shall weave old England's winding sheet. Now, for all we might see Blake as being ahead of his time, he believed that what are comparatively small actions like gambling and what we now call sex work were the indication of an immoral society. And people have discussions about that, obviously, to this day. I don't really want to get massively bogged down by that, about the actual morality and what we individually think about these things. Beyond saying, cards on the table, I think the very least we can say is that we want to keep people safe. whether they be sex workers or gamblers or whatever they may be. Now, whilst we have to be careful not to downplay some of the more troubling aspects of Blake's language here, I can hardly believe that he wouldn't have been aware of the coercive nature of, particularly of the sex industry. Now, we can also talk about gambling as well, but the sex industry in particular, I think he would have known what that was like. And it's interesting that on that point, he doesn't appear to acknowledge as such the people who are actually caught up in this, or to sort of absolve them of blame. But what he does do is place the majority, certainly, of the blame on the state. And so, we can think about what it might have looked like had Blake sort of been aware entirely of all the ins and outs of this. But that is one part that I think is important that we acknowledge, and that we have a discussion about. Finally, I want to talk about a story from William Blake's life, and I want to share this with you because it illustrates the kind of societal changes that Blake lived through, and in particular how dangerous it could be. It also, and this is not, I haven't seen this anywhere, but it also makes me wonder whether a certain amount of Blake's use of metaphor is a kind of plausible deniability strategy. Hopefully you'll see what I mean as we read this. Now, the story is best told by his biographer, a guy called Alexander Gilchrist. He was writing in the mid-1800s. It was actually released, the biography of William Blake was actually released after Gilchrist's death. It was completed, it was largely completed, but it was finished by his wife, and I think possibly one or two others, and released in 1863. And I'll read a portion of that for you now. High visions and patient industry, friendly intercourse with his neighbours, happy enjoyment of nature, were all interrupted for Blake in the autumn of 1803 by an incongruous event in a peaceful and innocent life. One day in August, a drunken soldier, probably from the barracks at Aldwick or Chichester, broke into the little slip of garden fronting the painter's sequestered cottage, and was there as violent and unruly as is the wont of drunken soldiers to be. He refused to go. The redcoat was a great hulking fellow, the artist of short stature, but robust, well-knit, with plenty of courage, and capable of a supernatural energy, as it were, on occasions. In his exasperation he laid hold of the intrusive blackguard, and turned him out neck and crop in a kind of inspired frenzy, which took the man aback and fairly frightened him, such volcanic wrath being a novelty in his experience. "I do not know how I did it, but I did it," said Blake afterwards, and was himself disposed to attribute his success to that demoniac or spiritual will by stress of which he believed a man might achieve anything physical. In the course of the scuffle, while blows were being exchanged, angry words passed, of course, the red-coated bully vapouring that he was the king's soldier, and so forth. "Damn the king, and you too," said Blake, with pardonable emphasis, a not unnatural reply, perhaps. But the event proved it to be an imprudent outburst, even as late as 1803. The soldier, bent on revenge, out of Blake's hasty words, made up a story and got a comrade to bear him out, that his rough host had been guilty of seditious language. The sequel forcibly reminds us we are here in the times of the good old king, not in those of Victoria. The soldier and his mate made their charge on oath before a magistrate, and Blake had to stand trial for high treason at the next quarter sessions. Now, thankfully, Blake was found not guilty, and he must have felt a huge relief at this, because at the time, those charges carried the penalty of death, potentially. And up until very recent times, they carried the potential penalty of death, although, of course, it wasn't, hadn't been carried out for years and years and years. But either way, Blake must have been relieved at this. It wasn't, I would imagine, an unusual outburst, as is hinted in the bit of the biography that we read. William Blake was massively anti-establishment. He was angry and, as I sort of said earlier, railed against injustice, but he blamed it on the state. He blamed it on the established church. He blamed it on people with power and wealth, essentially, wealthy capitalists forcing people into poverty and horrific working conditions and long hours and that kind of thing. And so the idea that Blake was a Republican and very certainly anti a drunken soldier in his garden, shouldn't surprise us at all. Although perhaps it might surprise us given the era. Anyway, this I think we'll stop the video here, because we've already spoken for a long time, given that this is supposed to be a short introduction and analysis. There's a lot more we could cover, but as I said at the start, this is not a classroom. But if you want to learn more, William Blake has had a lot written about him. He is studied in classrooms all the time, so there's a lot of information out there about him, and I'd really encourage you to have a look at some of his other poems as well. Some of my favourites, the obvious one would be The Tiger, that you may have read before, Tiger, Tiger, burning bright in the forests of the night, that one. Another one I love is a little one called The Fly, and I won't read it here, but it's a beautiful little poem about an occasion where Blake felt guilt for flapping a fly away, and he has the wonderful line, "Art not thou a man like me?" And so give that little poem a read as well. His most famous works are Songs of Innocence and of Experience, and both of those poems are in that collection. Actually, those collections, there's technically two collections there. But so do have a read of those, and I'll look forward to having you along for our next poem. See you soon.